In arguments, we sometimes run across the phenomenon of missing premises. Certain arguments that have missing premises are called enthymemes, which is a technical term that the great Greek philosopher Aristotle used to describe them. But why would anyone omit a premise from an argument? Because they assume that the missing premise is so obvious that it need not be stated. It's important to note that the principles of charity and faithfulness require that we explicitly state any missing premises when we reconstruct an argument. If I argue that you haven't taken any of the exams, so you can't pass, I'm actually leaving out a premise that I believe we can take for granted. But in reconstructing the argument, I must include the statement, you must take the exams to pass. That's the missing premise. We sometimes also have unstated conclusions, but these are rare. Here's an example. Any real man would have the guts to enlist in the Marines, but Harold won't. We need to explicitly identify unstated conclusions as well. In this example, as you can see, the author of the argument has excluded the conclusion for rhetorical effect. He wants us to draw the conclusion that Harold's not a real man. The argument should be reconstructed thus. Premise 1, any real man would have the guts to enlist in the Marines. Premise 2, Harold won't enlist in the Marines. Unstated conclusion, therefore, Harold's not a real man. Missing premises can also be called implicit or even suppressed premises. Here's a short video that illustrates how to handle implicit premises in reconstructing an argument.
When we present an argument for a conclusion, we don't explicitly state all the premises required for getting to the conclusion. Consider this example. Premise 1. Mike is a Canadian. Conclusion? Mike must be polite. To get from the premise that Mike is a Canadian to the conclusion that Mike is polite, we need a second premise, saying that all Canadians are polite. Only then is this argument strictly valid. Only then does the conclusion follow from the premises. Now, premise 2 here, the premise that all Canadians are polite, is an example of what we call a suppressed premise. Consider this other example. Premise 1, smoking will damage your health. Conclusion? So you shouldn't do it. Here, the suppressed premise is the claim that you shouldn't do things that damage your health. Now notice that in both of these cases, even though these suppressed premises are required for the argument to be valid, it seems nonetheless acceptable to leave them only implicit, to not state them explicitly. But why is this? I would suggest the following, that it's okay to keep a premise suppressed if two conditions are met. First, that the premise is uncontroversial. And second, that it's obvious to the person being presented with the argument. If both of these conditions are met, then it seems acceptable to keep the premise suppressed. Sometimes, however, a premise will be left implicit, will be left suppressed, even if it fails to meet these conditions. Now, sometimes this is done unintentionally, other times it's done in order to make the argument appear more persuasive than it really is. Regardless, that's why it's important to be sensitive to the possibility of suppressed premises, and to develop a habit for identifying them. Consider the following argument. Premise 1, killing an innocent person is wrong. Conclusion, therefore abortion is wrong. The suppressed premise here is something like, to have an abortion is to kill an innocent person. That's the suppressed premise. Now, regardless of whether this premise is true or false, it certainly isn't uncontroversial. It doesn't meet condition 1. Nor can one count on others taking this premise to be obvious. It doesn't meet condition 2. It's therefore a premise that should be made explicit and critically reflected upon when assessing the strength of the argument. It's in cases like this where sensitivity to suppressed premises is truly important.
Advertising has elevated unstated premises and conclusions to an art form. Take this Samsung advertisement where a young man follows a certain smartphone's launch in 2007 all the way to its most recent launch a decade later.
I used to be spellbound in
This man, who seems always to be waiting in line at the Apple Store, experiences countless issues with his iPhone throughout the years, including low storage, small screens, lack of water resistance.
You gotta send me that pic.
Missing headphone jacks, etc. Not surprisingly, our hero finally switches to a Galaxy Note 8. Although it is never stated and is only implicit, you can guess what iconic brand Samsung is making fun of here.